Thank you all for coming. We appreciate the quick transition from room to room. My name is Eddie Fernandez. I'm Sustainability Communications Manager here at Ford. Hope everyone's had a great day so far. Really excited to introduce this next panel, talking about the nexus between climate change and leading business. So just to kick it off, I'm going to introduce you to Ford's climate scientist on staff, Tim Wellington, to go ahead and talk a little bit more about what Ford is doing and how businesses and NGOs can work together. Here's Tim.
Okay, thank you very much. So hello and welcome to our online audience from around the world who are joining us through greenbiz.com for this panel discussion, Business in the Age of Climate Change. My name's Tim Wellington. I'm a senior technical leader in environmental science at Ford Motor Company, and it's a pleasure to be here at the North American International Auto Show here in Detroit. Before I get started, just a few housekeeping items for the folks online. So if you're online, you can download the slides that will be presented using the buttons at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, and we hope that you do have questions, click on the Ask a Question tab and type in your question and send it to us. And finally, the Twitter hashtag for the meeting is Ford NAIAS. And that's also, there's a little box on the screen, or there should be. So we're going to have three parts to the program this afternoon. We're going to start off with a panel discussion. We're going to hear from our three panelists. And then we're going to have a bit of Q&A. And I'm going to start off by taking questions from the people online. And then we're going to transition to the audience here. Then in the second part, we're going to divide you guys into three groups. And our panelists are going to circulate amongst the groups so you can get a little bit more intimate sort of contact and get your questions answered, hopefully. And then we're going to come back together for a little bit of a wrap-up. So to begin, I'm a climate scientist, and I work at Ford Motor Company in the research labs, and I've been working there for quite a long time, and I think it's really cool that a company like Ford Motor Company actually has climate scientists on staff. I think it's a little unusual. And I'm really proud that Ford Motor Company really gets the importance of climate change and the importance of climate change to business. And we've developed a science-based approach to basing our strategy to address climate change. And we think that's a key source of differentiation and a key source of competitive advantage for us. And so, we're obviously very excited to be here today to talk about business in the age of climate change. And to help us discuss that, we've got three distinguished panelists. They are, sitting nearest to me, Matt Banks, who is a Senior Program Officer for Climate Change for the World Wildlife Fund. He works with businesses to build awareness and adoption of climate management strategies through a program called Climate Savers. And Climate Savers has about 30, Matt's going to fill you in on more of these details, about 30 companies who are involved in this, and it saved over 100 million tons of CO2 emissions, so obviously very significant. Before Matt was working at WWF, he was developing sustainability indicators, and he developed those for the island of Nantucket, the city of Pittsburgh, the Trust for Public Land, and he was also responsible for launching the greenhouse gas inventory estimations for the city of Boston as well. Next, we have Andrew Winston. Andrew is a best-selling author and globally recognized green business expert. He's the author of a book called Green Recovery and the author of a book called Green to Gold. He's a recognized expert on how business can profit from environmental thinking, and he's advised some of the world's leading companies, to name but a few: Bank of America, Boeing, Bridgestone, Johnson & Johnson, and Pepsi. And Andrew received his BA in economics from Princeton. He has an MBA from Columbia. And last but not least, he has a Master's of Environmental Management from Yale. Sitting furthest from me is John Vieira, and John is our Global Director of Sustainability and Environment at the Ford Motor Company. He is responsible for developing global sustainable business plans and policies and reporting externally on those and engaging with our external stakeholders. Not only has he been doing this, but in the past he's led the efforts in the development of our first natural gas pickup truck, and he served as the chief engineer for the company's compact pickup trucks and its full-size sport utility or SUV vehicles. And also John led the company's midterm cost reduction plan, and he was responsible for pulling together a team that saved the company $1.2 billion within 18 months. John has a bachelor's from University of Michigan in mechanical engineering and also an MBA from Michigan. So, without any further ado, we're going to welcome our first speaker, Matt Banks.
Thanks so much. It's a really nice opportunity to come and talk about this subject in this setting. This is an incredibly important topic for our organization. We're going to have to move fairly quickly and have a lot to cover, so I don't know if we can ask the guys in the back to bring up the first slide. But I'll tell you a little bit about WWF, a little bit about climate savers, and a little bit about the larger macro challenge that we see the planet facing. We are the largest conservation organization in the world. We're active in over 100 countries. We have over 5 million members, 1.2 million in the US, and our focus is to protect the biodiversity on Earth. Our focus is really on helping companies and a lot of other stakeholders develop innovative global conservation strategies. And in the US, our focus is on 19 priority places, and those include the Northern Great Plains, the Arctic, the Amazon, the Congo. But the biggest sort of threat to all of those things is global climate change. So climate change is the biggest threat to World Wildlife Fund because we just celebrated our 50th anniversary. And we've been executing conservation around the world for over 50 years. And there is no bigger threat to that mission that will undermine our success, if not climate change. Climate Savers was our answer to sort of mobilizing companies to cut their carbon emissions. And we started with 2 companies in 1999. We grew that portfolio to 14 in the US and 30 around the world. Those companies have now cut over 100 million metric tons of emissions, and that's roughly the same as taking about 30 million cars off the road, or double the annual emissions of a mid-sized European country like Switzerland. And so the partners in that program include companies like Volvo, Coca-Cola, Nike, IBM, Johnson & Johnson, SuperValue, HP, and many others. We released that data about the 100 million metric tons back in May, and it made a lot of good headlines across a lot of different publications that I'm sure many of you follow. Environmental Leader, Business Green, Bloomberg. The one I liked the most was WWF leading corporate giants to epic carbon cuts. So it's encouraging news that we got a lot of companies to really set these ambitious goals. Those goals go into a contract that's signed by their executive and our executive. It commits them to those goals. We monitor those over time. We require third-party auditing every year. And they're on track to not only meet those goals, but exceed them. So what we come to find is that when companies start to harvest all these energy efficiency opportunities, they find more and more and are able to often double or triple their target. The benefits for those companies are significant financial savings. There's hundreds of millions of dollars that have been reaped. And there's a series of case studies on our website that showcase those. Okay. They're members in an elite alliance of industry-leading companies that really have their climate strategy validated as best in class. When you have the world's largest conservation organization with the most reputable brand, it really helps to validate that strategy is the best in their industry. They also get access to science and policy experts within our teams. They come together for an annual summit every year. Last year it was in Rotterdam. This year it'll be in Mexico City. And really kind of assistance navigating this ever-changing landscape of climate protection within the business circles. It's constantly changing. The reporting is changing. It seems to have leveled out for the most part with the help of things like the Carbon Disclosure Project, but it's a tricky place to navigate. There we go. The issue, if there was ever a year that climate became really in focus for most folks, it was definitely this year. And so these are some of the headlines. This one from the Washington Post Express was one that I picked up on the way to work just last week. We've survived. We survived America's hottest year ever. We shattered the temperature record, and that's significant because a lot of the trends that were prescribed in a lot of these scientific models are being overrun and exceeded the models that predicted some of the things coming. This Bloomberg Business Week piece is it's global warming stupid shortly after Hurricane Sandy, and of course the cover of the Philadelphia Inquirer after they got hit with the storm on the Jersey Shore. But the one in the corner there is how do we win the battle against global warming, and that's really what our organization tries to focus on. Really, decades of science points to 2 degrees Celsius as the maximum safe increase in global average surface temperature for the planet. Then you get a lot of dangerous runaway scenarios if we exceed that. In the US, roughly 66% of global warming gases come from the corporate sector. And that generates about 4.4 gigatons a year of carbon. Next. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recommends about an 80% reduction for Annex 1 countries. So that's the developed world that we know, below 1990 levels by 2050 or 25% below 1990 levels by 2020. So if the US corporate sector, and that's all business activity in the United States, wanted to align with that target, that means that we need to work toward about a 3% reduction annually between now and 2020. So that's about a 3% decrease across the entire private sector. What that translates to is about a 1.2 billion ton carbon reduction per year between now and 2020. And we've been working on looking at this problem with the Carbon Disclosure Project. So the goal is to lower GHG emissions by a proportional share of what's required by 2020 to about a 3 gigaton emission rate per year. This would mean about a 3 to 6% reduction per year, depending upon when you start and what baseline you're starting from. Again, that's about an annual reduction of 1.2 gigatons per year between now and 2020. And this characterizes that reduction. Of all the U.S. companies reporting to CDP, and there are about 300 in the S&P 500 that report to the Carbon Disclosure Project, most of them, about 80%, saw a higher return on investment from their investments targeting energy efficiency and greenhouse gas reductions than their average portfolio of investments across all their business units. So not only is this the right thing to do, it makes incredibly good business sense, and there's a significant amount of savings to be harvested. I'll skip through this one. On to the next one. Again, the importance of when we start and how quickly we amplify the reductions is really important. If we wait until 2020, we need to achieve an 8.7% reduction per year. And that, I think, is insurmountable for most companies. Next slide. If we wait till 2030, we're looking at close to a 95% reduction. So the window that we have to address this problem is closing very, very quickly. And the ability that we have to help stabilize the emissions as the American business community is vitally important at this point in time. If we don't run after it right now, we won't be able to catch up. So what we're asking companies to do, not just within Climate Savers, but as we look at how to go from 30 companies to 300 companies or 3,000 companies, is commit to ambitious reduction targets. Again, the old adage is if you don't manage it, it doesn't get measured. Or sorry, the other way around. If you don't measure it, it doesn't get managed. And that is so true. In all of the companies within our U.S. portfolio, again, we've seen companies that are able to set a manageable goal, and then they can set a stretch goal that exceeds everybody's expectations. Investing in the right energy efficiency opportunities is also important. Investing in clean energy and cleaning the energy mix that your company is using and getting away from fossil-generated electricity and into renewables. Influencing your value chain and driving innovation, which we heard a lot about the last day and a half with Ford. Collaborating with a broad set of stakeholders, working with NGOs, working with government, working with other companies. This last example was really impressive of other companies collaborating to meet the challenge. Next slide. I'll close there and encourage discussion thereafter. I think we got through this fairly quickly, and Andrew, you may run into the same challenges I did with both the format change and also the clicker.
Let's see if this is working. Okay. Well, a round of applause for getting, when your slides screw up, that's not easy. I've been through that. I'm just going to start the timer. I've been through that. It's not fun. So you're going to hear probably a lot of interesting statistics or amazing stats. The most amazing one might be that I'm only 5 years older than him. I look like his father, but I'm only 5 years. I discovered that this last day. It kind of freaked me out. I'm questioning my life choices at the moment right now. But like good living, I don't know. So anyways, John has asked me to come today. Thank you, John, for inviting me and provide a little perspective. And in particular, because he knows that I've spoken about something that Ford's doing, what we're hearing a lot about today, which is setting their goals based on science, and that'll be one of the elements I'll talk about. But it's one of a few things that I'm working on now in my next book, which this is the working title of my next book right now, and I'll be happy to take input on that, because I'm sure nobody in this room has opinions on things, I'm sure, and hear what you think of this. But it's this idea that we need to switch pretty seriously what business is about and what institutions are about, what society is about. From doing sustainability, I think when we get to it, when the hurdle rate is met, when we think it's economic in very strict terms, and pivot to doing sustainability and solving the world's giant problems as the goal of these organizations and as the goal of most business, and working back from there to say, how do we use capitalism and markets, and how do we do that the most profitably, compete to do it the most profitably. But we have to set out to solve a challenge as big as climate change. And so the three really big challenges or pressures on companies that I'll kind of highlight in this book as kind of the intro are the fact that we're getting hotter, that resources are getting scarcer, and that the world is getting a lot more open. Witness the fact that you're taking pictures and tweeting and discussing this right now, real time. This is a transparent world that we're in. By the way, my Twitter is Andrew Winston, which is pretty clear and obvious in case you want to tweet me. So well, I'm going to try to just jump right in, and we're going to have to go pretty quickly. But again, we're pivoting from this place where green is just considered expensive in business. And while I think we are moving fast away from this, it is still really prevalent. Most of the CSOs I know in companies are still working to change the culture in companies that environment is expensive, and we're going to have to pivot from thinking of it as expensive to thinking of it as both profitable and an incredible opportunity for innovation and to create value. And so let me talk about quickly two of the three big forces that I mentioned. One is the scarcer point, just the pressure on resources. Every year in China, they build somewhere around 7.5 billion square feet of new space. This might be slowing down a little bit in recent year or two, but this is the pace they've been going. I looked at kind of what that was in terms of building and how big that was. Can we go to the next picture? Every year, and you can go to the next one, every year China builds not one Midtown Manhattan, but 31 Midtown Manhattans every year. The demand on resources is just immense. You can go to the next one. And this is a slide with some data from a guy named Jeremy Grantham. He's an asset manager, and he kind of pushes the idea that commodities is the most important kind of asset class and investment we have because of these pressures. These are just some of the data points. At the bottom is the percentage of world resources that China, the percentage of the world GDP that China represents. It's 10%. So arguably, they should use about 10% of the resources in different categories. But as you can see, oil they use about 10%. But cement, China uses over half the world's cement. About half the world's pigs are in China right now. For some reason, that one really grabs me. That's the one I can really picture. So we're facing a very big demand and supply mismatch. Now, moving to the hotter part, that's really shortening the discussion of the scarcer pressure. But the hotter part, this was, I think, Goldman, or at least one of the big banks, trying to block Hurricane Sandy. They actually did keep water out of their lobby, but I try to imagine that these were actually money bags instead of cement. But I live in Connecticut. I dealt with Hurricane Sandy. This was the PATH station in New Jersey. This reminded me of The Shining. Remember the blood rushing in across the door? This picture, for some reason, just really said to me, this is really not natural. This is rushing into a place that it shouldn't. There's a whole bunch of pictures I could go into, but some of these really just got to me about how deep the disruption is that we're facing now. This is actually my street and why we didn't have power for about a week. This was, of course, what we saw once we got pictures of what was going on in New Jersey. We have this issue right now about when is climate change going to be an issue, or when is it going to be a material risk to business? Well, by the time climate change was clearly a material risk to Seaside Heights, New Jersey, the town was gone. We keep waiting till we get some clear signal. And even today, I'm hearing oh, I'm not sure. We'll see how damaging climate change will be. It's well, we're seeing this is happening already. Can you move on to the next one? But the weather is also enhancing or making worse this resource constraint problem. This was a flood in Australia a couple years ago, and it wasn't just that people couldn't get to their McCafe. That was pretty bad, not getting to your coffee, but it was that the water was rising where the coal was being produced. This was a huge, huge commodity for Australia, a big part of their economy, and it flooded. This was the Wall Street Journal saying these floods are affecting their ability. We're seeing this, I think, the most in food. Of the commodities that we're seeing the pressure, it's happening in food. These were the wildfires in Russia 2 years ago. But we've been seeing massive problems around the world, especially here now, the drought over the last year, that it's affecting the crop outlook. And so what you're hearing in the press is, this was a statement in the Times about a year ago, a warming planet struggles to feed itself. We are now seeing prices rise for the first time on food in decades, and the number of hungry people rise for the first time. It was going down even as population was rising for 40, 50 years. But we're now seeing problems with food. And to take this back to the business connection, which is what I always do in my work, this costs real money. This is material to the business. Coca-Cola announced late in 2011 that in that year they were spending about $800 million more than they had expected to on commodities, on corn. Because as you know, Coca-Cola is liquid corn. It's not slightly liquid corn, it's entirely liquid corn. It's 100% liquid corn. That's what corn syrup is. It is. So this is a huge expense issue for them, right? And I just saw this recently, an analyst, one of the Morningstar analysts took a look at Tyson Foods and said, what is the commodity increase price going to do to them? They think it's going to cost them about $700 million more to make the chicken, to feed the chicken. Their net income over the last few years has been like 500, 800 million. This is their whole profit. Probably wiped out unless they find other ways to cut costs. And now to turn to the imperative, and we heard some of these statistics from Matt. This is a chart from McKinsey, and because I found this totally inscrutable, I redrew it and decided to make it simpler. They did one really important piece of analysis over the last couple years, and we now have numbers, right? We've always wondered, how fast do we need to move? We now have the numbers. McKinsey has told us that, look, we get a certain amount of economy, GDP, out of every ton of carbon. Right now it's about $700. By 2050, we need to take that up to $7,000 of global economy out of every ton of carbon. You either do that by using less energy in total, obviously, or switching to just non-carbon sources. But this tenfold increase in the next 38 years is the fastest humanity will ever have done anything if we can pull this off. We once took one input into the economy, labor productivity, up this much, tenfold, during the Industrial Revolution. That took 140 years. We have to do it in 38. We have to do something we've never done. And then PwC, I'm in a partnership with PwC, and this was kind of separate from my work with them, the UK division, did a very similar analysis and said it in a different way. They said the carbon intensity of our economy must improve 5% a year on average between now and 2050. That's a big number because last year it improved about 0.8%. We naturally improve our carbon intensity, but now we got to do it much, much faster. So the question I keep asking business now is how deep does the change need to be? And the change has to be very, very deep. And that's kind of the point of the big pivot. We need to pivot what we're about. And so I want to just highlight 3 of the kind of 10 points that will be in my next book whenever I find the time to write it. And these are kind of 3 key elements that I think we need to see in corporate America. And the first one is this idea of science-based goals. And Ford is actually like the main example I have of this. And we'll hear a little bit more from John later, so I'm not going to kind of steal his thunder too much, but they set out this path for their product development based on trying to hold emissions to 450 parts per million, which at the time they started this process was kind of the consensus. I think the consensus has dropped somewhat, but it's a pretty aggressive goal at this point. We're about at 400 parts per million now. And they said, this means that we have to take a look at 2 big paths in the world. The auto industry, we have to think about internal combustion engines, alternative fuels, alternative drivetrains, and the other path is the grid itself, electricity, because if we're going to plug in all these cars, the grid has to get cleaner too. They said this was a glide path. This was the product planning based on the goal of climate stabilization. Nobody's really doing this. Very few companies. One of the only other ones I've seen is Unilever, arguably the leader in corporate sustainability right now. But they, in their sustainable living plan, said, we're going to hit the UN goal of 50 to 80% reduction by 2050. Almost no companies have said this. We have goals that sound like it. Walmart and Procter & Gamble said they want to be 100% renewable energy, but they haven't said by when. It's like someday, Well, we now know the numbers of how fast we need to go, and almost nobody's doing it. So we have a serious problem. So what this means to me is that innovation needs to get much deeper. Change needs to get much deeper. Here's a smart guy, and what he said about coming up with ideas, or how do you solve a problem? He said, if I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on it, I'd take the first 55 minutes and ask the right questions. I think we need to ask different questions, heretical questions, meaning challenging the very nature of our business. And you're starting to see companies do that. And the nature of the challenge is stemming all the way up from kind of minor process changes, but really radically different ways of doing it, to product changes, all the way up to changing entire business models. And I just want to give a couple quick examples. Next, there we go. Adidas just came out with a number that I love. There's a lot of competition in apparel for some reason, which is great when sectors kind of start competing on this. Adidas came out with some numbers that I actually had to go check myself because I didn't believe it. I mean, I see a lot of statistics about our impact on the world, and this one kind of blew me away. Every 2 years, the apparel industry, the global apparel industry, to just dye our clothing, to like color set the clothing, uses water at the scale equivalent to the Mediterranean Sea. Every 2 years, we use the Mediterranean Sea worth of water. So they came up with a new way to make a t-shirt, a colorful t-shirt, to dye the color using a small company's technology. So this kind of matching of small, new entrepreneurial with big companies that can scale it is another part of the news story. They found a way to put the color into the shirt with no water, so water-free. So to me, this is deeply disruptive as a process. They didn't say, how can we use 10% less water, 20%, 100% less water? So the question they asked was different. Why do we even need water? That's the kind of question we have to ask in our processes. Next. I'm going to skip over this because you guys know there's a whole big movement of open innovation. Pretend I told you something really interesting about it. But there's open innovation going on in green. Heineken's had some really good stuff. They've come up with some really funny ideas. Let me just show you quickly, actually, because it's so funny. One of the winning entries, or one of the entries to this open innovation thing on packaging, was a tap truck that you could just like pull up to, like, I imagine a fraternity, and just, you don't even need packaging. That was their packaging kind of heretical innovation, was why packaging? Just bring the truck. I just thought that was absolutely brilliant. So inviting everyone into innovation is a really new idea, right? And we're just getting going. We're also challenging capitalism. We're challenging entire business models. And Patagonia is always out there on the forefront. And I always kind of hesitate to use them because they can do whatever they want. I mean, Yvon Chouinard started a company to kind of help him surf and climb mountains more. And the company's only maybe gets in the way of that, So it's an unusual company. But we're starting to see large companies, large public companies, follow their lead on many things, and much quicker than they used to follow. And so about a year ago, they launched this thing, the Common Threads Initiative, where they said, we have a grand bargain to propose. We'll make useful stuff that lasts a long time. You don't buy something if you don't need it. And did anyone see this ad they ran a year ago, don't buy this jacket? Don't buy it. Even within Patagonia, I talked to them. Even within Patagonia, this was kind of heretical to say, don't buy our stuff. We're going to make it last really long. And so again, this is a company that can do what it wants, but Marks & Spencer also, next one. In the UK, Marks & Spencer, the retailer, started this thing, Schwab, about a year ago. You know, where they said, when you buy clothes, come bring old ones in, one for one. We want to, you know, kind of close the loop and find a use for these. This is not super far from what Patagonia did. They didn't go all the way to, hey, don't buy the clothes, but they're trying to say close the loop. So what if we pitched customers on using less of our product? That's the deeply heretical question we all need to ask now, that we're seeing the very leading edge of companies, more business to business. That's an easier conversation, but even in the consumer realm, starting to ask. And finally, as a kind of third element of this, can you go to the next one? I think companies, again, need to switch and pivot towards this focus on sustainability, but in a way it's old school. Next picture, please. If you look at the business bestsellers, the best, most selling books, highest selling books of almost all time in business, they're things like In Search of Excellence, Good to Great, Built to Last. Do you see any title in there that's How I Upped My Quarterly Earnings 7% this year? I mean, this is about greatness. Building amazing enterprises that try to solve a customer problem, do it the best you can, and shareholders will be pleased once we've done the main purpose of the business, which is to build a great product or service and provide it to people. We've kind of lost our way. And so Unilever, again, has done something very unusual. The CEO there said a couple years ago, Wall Street, I'm not going to talk to you every quarter. He said, if you buy into this long-term value model, it's equitable and sustainable, et cetera, you can come invest with us. If you don't, I respect you as a human being, but put your money elsewhere. That's a nice way of saying he doesn't respect them as a human being, but I thought it was very, very well done. He hasn't been followed by almost any CEOs. I think it's a travesty. And there's a lot of reasons for that we can talk about in Q&A, but we have a big gap here. We are focused on quarterly profits to the extent of, kind of to the exclusion of almost everything else in this country, and I think it's to the detriment of just building great companies, even aside from sustainability. And so finally, I just want to end on a positive note. We have these really deep changes to make, but we are headed in a very real, very large clean economy direction. The bank HSBC has said that the clean tech market will be over $2 trillion by 2020. It's a big number, big number. And I think one of the most unusual guys in the world who's a combination of billionaire entrepreneur, usually doesn't go together too often, has said this kind of attack on climate, building the clean economy, is the greatest wealth generating opportunity of our generation. I'll end on that note, and I'm happy to answer some questions later. Thank you. This is not working very well. Do you need this?
Thank you very much, Andrew. Now it's John
try?
Vieira.
Sort of.
Okay, we'll see. Well, thank you, Andrew. I was going to get behind a podium with my notes, but I'm not going to do that because Andrew got up here and was talking. And I just want to say, first of all, thanks to Matt and Andrew. I think they bring great credibility to the panel. And originally, I was supposed to speak first, and so I was planning on speaking first. I said, well, no, just put me last. And my team was like, you're going after Matt and Andrew. If you're going to speak last, keep it brief, right, and get off the stage, because those guys are really good, because they are. They're fantastic, and they did a great job. I really think set the tone really well for what I really want to do is kind of wrap things up in terms of both Matt and Andrew talked about, obviously the significance of climate change. And, the question out there is there a business, for a big company, for a small company, is there a business behind addressing climate change on the one hand, but also being in the business of making money on the other hand? I mean, can that be done? And at Ford, we absolutely believe it can be done, and it's actually core to our strategy. And that's really what I want to share today. So I don't know if everybody recognizes this gentleman. It's Bill Ford. Bill Ford, as you know, is our executive chairman for the company, was actually back in 2005. Many of you might not know this. Back in 2005, when climate change maybe wasn't even talked about as much as it is now, obviously, or as vogue, Bill Ford came out, and we actually came out in a public statement that said climate change is real, that man has an impact on, addressing or having a negative impact on climate change, and then we as a company need to do something about it. So that came back in 2005, and so the good news for me, right, as the head sustainability guy for the company, having the executive chairman, somebody like Bill Ford that makes that statement, that has their name on the building, that's a big help. And Bill really believes that, but he believes it for a couple of reasons. Yes, he's an environmentalist and cares about the earth, But for the other reason that this was important and why Bill really believes in this is that when you look at his great-grandfather, Henry Ford, right? Back in 1925, right, he took out an article, and what was the newspaper, Mark, they took it out in? The Washington Evening Post, I think it was, right? Is that right? Washington Evening Post. And he basically said his vision was to provide transportation, affordable transportation to the masses, right, for many, many years to come. And he was successful in that, right? For the last 100 years or so, right, we've been producing vehicles, almost always internal combustion engine vehicles, that have done very well. Bill Ford says he wants us to be a sustainable company for the next 100 years. But oh, by the way, can't be the same vehicle that Henry Ford put out there. It needs to be sustainable. So what does that mean? It means a couple of things. Number one, and you could see it written down here, I don't have to read it to you, but it means not just relying on vehicles that run on petroleum. We need to start looking at alternative fuels and eventually moving to completely decarbonized fuels. You know, electricity off of a clean grid, hydrogen-powered vehicles, potentially cellulosic ethanol. That's what we need to move to. That's the vision that's going to allow us to be a sustainable company in the future. That's number one. The second item, which I'm not going to get into significantly here, and it kind of gets back to the Patagonia example. What Bill Ford has also realized that if we want to be a mobility company in the future, even if we're producing all electric vehicles, right, that are getting their electricity from a clean grid, if we produce more and more of those vehicles and they can't move around because congestion's really bad, we're not a very effective mobility company. So the other element that we need to do looking forward is how do we think differently about moving people and goods? There's always going to be vehicles that we're going to produce, but we need to think differently on how we're going to produce those vehicles and allow people to have mobility and still be able to move around. So that's the second element of mobility that we're really focused on. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, so we're going to define sustainability. Everybody's seen this definition probably before, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the future. It's kind of the three-legged stool, the environmental, the social, and the economic. And the reason I'm showing this particular slide is twofold. Number one, everybody recognizes the three legs, but the economic piece is really important because this gets back to the title, right? What are the business aspects of climate change? I know when I first got into this job, I've been at the company for going on 29 years now. So for the first 26 years, I was in product development, or first 25 years, I was in product development. And when I got into this job, I remember, a message coming down from the top of the house, and they said, as you develop your sustainability plans, one thing needs to be made perfectly clear. You are not the philanthropic arm of Ford Motor Company. We have that. It's called the Ford Fund. They do wonderful things, right? From a charitable standpoint, they do wonderful things. You're the sustainability office. So when you develop your environmental and social strategies, it has to be grounded in economic goodness, right? And it wasn't a threat. It was somewhat of a challenge. It wasn't a threat, but that was really key. So when we move forward, we always thought about we have to create the business case when we even start looking at things like addressing climate change. And on the environmental element, the biggest impact that we have on the environment as a company is the CO2 emissions coming from our tailpipe. It's 99% of our carbon footprint. So if we did nothing else, the one thing that we need to do is to address and reduce the amount of carbon dioxide coming from our tailpipe. Now the good news is, from a business standpoint, when you improve your fuel economy, you in fact are reducing your CO2 by about the same proportion. And we know improvement in fuel economy translates into what? Better sales over our competitors' products, right? So ding, right? This is working pretty well, right? I could really hit a major customer satisfier at the same time have the biggest impact on the environment, and that's called improving fuel economy or reducing CO2. So next slide. I only have 6 total slides, so we're halfway done. We're doing well. All right, so what we're showing here, somewhat of a complicated slide, not overly complicated. In the middle, the very middle, you see that product CO2 strategy? That's what I'm going to focus on. The product CO2 strategy, saying it a different way, is what is our strategy 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, in terms of the amount of CO2 that's going to be emitted from our tailpipes. Saying it another way, the improvement in fuel economy over those periods of time. And we look at 4 different inputs. And I'm going to start from right to left. What is the competition doing? Because we need to have a competitive product in competition with regard to fuel economy / reducing CO2. What is the consumer asking for in terms of fuel economy / reducing CO2? How are governments regulating us, fuel economy standards, CO2 standards? Those are all inputs we consider. But what is it about those 3 inputs? They're pretty short term, right? You ask, what is the consumer going to be looking for 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Nobody knows. If they think they do know, buy them another drink, because they really don't know, right? That's too far out in the future. Competitors, yeah, you might have somewhat of an idea of what the competitors are doing, but in the long term, probably not. Regulation, we have some longer term regulations, but 30 years from now, there's no regulation. What is the one input there that we have the most certainty long term? It's stabilization. Right? I'm going to get into stabilization in a second here. But when you think about setting a strategy for climate stabilization, you could go out 50 years, 100 years, 150 years. So a lot of people ask, we talk about my role in many cases being a change agent within the company. So did I convince everybody at Ford Motor Company that climate change and addressing climate change has to be core to our strategy because climate change is so real and so urgent we need to do it right now? Was I able to convince everybody of that fact? No, I wasn't, right? I'd be disingenuous to say that I was. Now, a lot of people believed in that. Bill Ford believes in that. Alan Mulally believes in that, who's our CEO. That's very helpful. But the one element that really sold all of the product strategy folks in terms of accepting stabilization as really the core to develop our strategy, it sets long-term targets, right? They don't have to tear up their plans every 5 years because a regulation changes or the consumer that's out there is changing their mind on what to buy. That long-term target based upon stabilization allowed them to put together product plans 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now. And that's the beauty behind using climate science for your product strategy. All right, next slide. All right, so this just kind of shows the stabilization curves that you all have seen, 450 parts per million. Andrew has already mentioned it. So basically what we've done, our good friends here, the climate scientists, and it's kind of strange, right? Because typically when you develop a strategy at a big company, you don't go knocking on the door of the research folks and pull out the climate scientists and say, we need to develop our long-term product strategy, we need your help, right? But we did that in the case of Tim's team because they were able to put together an algorithm that really helped us define what is Ford's share, what is the auto sector share in terms of stabilizing at that 450 parts per million level, and then what's Ford's share of the industry. So we could say, and we would know what our targets need to be at any point in time along that curve theoretically from 2000 to 2050 to 2100. That allows us to have a CO2 target in any one of those years, and it's a long-term target. And that's the beauty behind really using climate stabilization for that. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so this slide is somewhat hard to read because of the colors, but the bottom line is this. What you're looking at is the output from a lot of the modeling that the research folks did basically says, if I know what my CO2 target is 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, what mix of vehicles do I need to be able to sell to deliver to those targets? And those mix of vehicles include the sizes of the vehicles, but also what should those vehicles be running on? Gasoline, diesel, biofuels or ethanol, natural gas, electric, hydrogen. What does that mix look like? And what this model kicked out, because again, it needs to make business sense, it kicked out hitting that CO2 target, but doing it in a way that delivers the most profits to the company. So early on in the near term, yeah, we're going to offer choices to people because there's individuals out there that want to run on natural gas or want to run on gasoline, want to run on electric. We're offering all those choices, and we're managing it in a way to make sure that we hit our CO2 target. What we do know is out in the future, in the midterm, so that center box is 2012 to 2020, we're going to need to have more electrified vehicles, right? We're starting to introduce them now. Right, as Mike Tinsky had mentioned in the previous panel, right, they're a small percentage of our overall fleet. That's okay. They don't have to be a large percentage now to hit our CO2 target. But 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, they need to be a higher percentage. So we're banking on the fact that, the growth isn't going to be, like a hockey stick and just grow hugely in the next couple of years. It doesn't need to. We start introducing electrified vehicles now. We allow them to grow at the right pace. We offer customers choices. And then when we need to have a higher percentage, we're able to actually have seeded the market so the market's ready for those vehicles. And then in the long term, we can get into things like fuel cells, right? That's probably longer term. But nonetheless, what climate stabilization has done for us, it's actually allowed us to lay out what we call a product sustainability strategy for our portfolio. That's worked very well. So with that, last slide. So, when it's all said and done, yes, climate stabilization was a core part of our strategy, but the reason it works so well is that, yes, for people inside the company that are very concerned about climate stabilization, they're all over it. They're all over that strategy. But the other key was because it made great business sense, and that great business sense is if I could have the most fuel-efficient products, which translates into lowest CO2 products, and if I give customer choices on being able to run on different types of fuels, and that's also going to improve my business case, then everybody in the company is going to be completely aligned with that strategy and the foundation to that strategy being climate stabilization. So with that, I think that concludes. Tim, you have, I need to sit back down, yes, right? And then you're going to turn it over for questions.
A few questions now. So
okay.
Thank you very much, John. And the other panelists, I've got 3 questions from the online audience, 1 for each speaker. Short questions, short answers, please.
Okay. Wow.
So Matt, first of all, how do you see WWF's involvement in climate change, in the climate change movement 10 years from now?
Wow. Short answer.
Short answer.
10 years. People normally ask about 5 years.
It's a long-term problem, right? So you got to.
Well, I think that the more that we listen to what's going on at the international negotiations, it looks like 2015 could be a pivotal year. Often, or similar to what people built up before Copenhagen. So everyone's looking for a global agreement in 2015. The political changes may allow for something to happen more easily at that time. So I would hope that we have a global agreement in 10 years that is supported by the business community.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, what is the one thing you're surprised to hear a business isn't doing?
That any business isn't doing?
Well, it's not too specific. So
yeah, I guess I'm always surprised, and we're still, I think, in a lot of ways in kind of the first or second inning of measuring, of metrics, and kind of understanding footprint up and down the value chain. I mean, we've kind of been saying this for years and years, and there's software companies now competing kind of viciously to offer companies lots of tools to do this. I'm kind of amazed when you run into companies and like, yeah, we kind of know our footprint. Every facility sends in to this guy, and he puts it in an Excel spreadsheet. I mean, this is state of the art. Just a few years ago, it was like the Excel spreadsheet mode of knowing how much energy each facility used. And that, frankly, there's not more companies doing what you two have done together, which is to say, again, like the whole point of my new book is work backward from what do we need to do. And this is something like Natural Step and others have been saying for many, many years. You have to kind of backcast. You say, what do we got to get to? I'm amazed more companies aren't kind of taking that approach and saying, what are the numbers and what does that mean for us and how would we get there, and just kind of plan it out. We're kind of head in the sand when it comes to the actual numbers that we need to approach.
Okay, thank you. And last but not least, John, what do you see as the single biggest improvement Ford has made or hopes to make quickly in regards to climate change?
So, short answer? Thank you for the question.
It's not my question.
So you're going to be surprised at this, right? Because we talked a lot about electrification. Probably the biggest improvement that we made, some people are going to cringe a little bit, is the improvement that we made with our internal combustion engine. A technology called EcoBoost, which basically allows us to have the power of a higher displacement, so people are familiar with like 6-cylinder and 8-cylinder engines, have the power and performance of an 8-cylinder engine with a 6-cylinder, because then you get the fuel economy of the 6-cylinder. Have the power and performance of a 6-cylinder engine with a 4-cylinder, so you could keep kind of cascading it down. And the reason why I say that has the biggest impact, because that technology is very, very affordable, and we can put it on millions of vehicles. So in the short term, it's having the biggest impact. Now, long term, we still need electrified vehicles. I'm not poo-pooing them for that. But if I only sell a small percentage of electrified vehicles, let's say at 0 or close to 0 emissions, or I sell millions and millions of this EcoBoost technology on our internal combustion engine across millions of vehicles, I actually have a bigger impact doing that. So short term, I would say that's the biggest impact that we've had so far.
Okay, thank you very much. So this will conclude for those online, the online portion of the program. The material here will be archived. You'll get an email next week showing you the link to that. But please stay online if you would for a few minutes more. There'll be a questionnaire of how we might improve this event. What you found useful, what you didn't find so useful, so we can improve it next time. So I'd like to. We're going to thank our speakers one more time, and then what we're going to do is we're going to divide into our 3 separate audiences, and then the speakers will rotate between you. So thank you very much to the panelists.